Fear is not rational, but it is always logical. I have spent 30 years studying human anxiety, watching people tremble before audiences of 5 while remaining calm in genuinely dangerous situations. The statistics are real. Surveys consistently show people ranking public speaking above death in their list of fears. This seems absurd until you understand what is actually happening in the human mind when we stand before a group. The fear is not about speaking. It is about exile. Deep in our brain's oldest structures, the same circuits that kept our ancestors alive are screaming a single message. Rejection by the group means death. When you stand before an audience, your primitive mind cannot distinguish between a boardroom presentation and being cast out from the tribe on the African savanna. Your body floods with the same chemicals, your heart races with the same urgency, because for most of human history, social rejection was indeed a death sentence. Before we continue, take a moment to notice where you're listening from, and if this story stays with you, you're welcome to return tomorrow for what comes next. I did not begin my career expecting to become an expert in public speaking anxiety. Like most clinical psychologists in the early 1990s, I thought I understood fear, depression, trauma, addiction. These seemed like the real battles. Speaking anxiety felt almost trivial by comparison. People were afraid to talk in front of others. So what? Get over it. That dismissive attitude lasted exactly until I met my first CEO patient. The manila folder on my desk that Tuesday morning in 1994 contained a puzzle that would reshape my understanding of human psychology. Patient 347, as I recorded him for confidentiality, was a 42-year-old executive who ran a manufacturing company with over 300 employees. This man negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts, fired people, made decisions that affected entire communities. His secretary described him as unflappable and the calmest person in any crisis. Yet here he sat in my office, hands trembling as he described his monthly ordeal, presenting quarterly reports to his board of directors. I throw up beforehand, he told me, staring at his shoes. Every single time. 7 board members. I know them all personally. Some are friends, but when I walk into that conference room, I become someone else entirely. I had seen anxiety before, but this was different. This was not a nervous teenager or someone with social difficulties. This was a man who commanded respect, who made life-altering decisions daily, reduced to a terrified child by the prospect of speaking to 7 people he knew well. What exactly happens, I asked, genuinely curious, now? My heart starts racing the night before. I rehearse obsessively, but when I stand up to speak, my mind goes completely blank. I can feel their eyes on me, judging every word. My voice cracks like I'm 13 again. I sweat through my shirt. Sometimes I feel like I might faint. The medical evaluation found nothing wrong. His physical health was excellent. This was not about competence or preparation. He knew his material better than anyone. This was something deeper. Over the following months, I began noticing a pattern that would define the next 3 decades of my research. The patients struggling most with speaking anxiety were often the most accomplished individuals I treated. Another executive, a surgeon who performed complex operations without hesitation but panic-attacked before medical conferences. A trial lawyer who commanded courtrooms but dissolved before speaking at his daughter's wedding. These were not weak people. They were not incompetent or unprepared. They possessed skills, knowledge, and life experience that should have made public speaking straightforward. Yet something primal was overriding their rational capabilities. I started keeping detailed notes, searching for commonalities. What I discovered challenged everything I thought I knew about anxiety disorders. The intensity of their fear seemed directly proportional to how much they cared about the audience's opinion. The surgeon struggled with medical conferences but felt fine addressing nurses he supervised daily. The CEO could speak comfortably to employees but fell apart before his peers. My patient 347 could present to clients without issue, but his board people, whose approval mattered for his career and identity, triggered something that transcended logic. Traditional therapy approaches were failing spectacularly. I tried cognitive behavioral techniques, teaching patients to challenge irrational thoughts. But their thoughts were not irrational within their own context. They knew, correctly, that their performance mattered. They understood, accurately, that poor presentations could damage their reputations. The fear made perfect sense given the stakes. Exposure therapy helped some, but only to a point. Gradual practice could reduce symptoms, but it never eliminated the underlying terror. Something fundamental was being missed. The breakthrough came during a session with patient 347 in his 8th month of treatment. He was describing his latest board presentation, which had gone reasonably well despite his usual pre-event panic. "You know what's strange?" he said. "When I was a kid, my biggest fear was that the other kids wouldn't like me, getting picked last for teams, eating lunch alone, that stuff. This feels exactly the same. Like if I mess up this presentation, they'll decide I don't belong." In that moment, I understood. This was not really about speaking. This was not about performance or competence or even judgment exactly. This was about belonging. This was about survival in its most primitive form. I began researching evolutionary psychology, something that had never interested me during graduate school. What I discovered would revolutionize my practice and my understanding of human nature itself. The fear these successful, rational adults experienced was not a malfunction. It was not weakness or lack of confidence. It was an ancient survival mechanism, perfectly designed for a different world, now activated in inappropriate contexts. For millions of years, human survival depended entirely on group acceptance. To be cast out from the tribe meant death within days. Our ancestors who feared social rejection survived and reproduced. Those who were indifferent to group opinion perished alone in the wilderness. Natural selection had gifted us with a hair-trigger alarm system designed to prevent social exile. The problem was that this system could not distinguish between a Stone Age tribal council and a modern boardroom presentation. Patient 347's brain, when he stood before his board of directors, was responding as if his very survival was at stake, because for most of human history, it would have been. This realization changed everything. I was no longer treating a speaking disorder. I was working with one of humanity's most fundamental and necessary survival instincts, simply misfiring in the modern world. The manila folder containing Patient 347's records still sits in my filing cabinet today. It represents the moment I stopped seeing public speaking anxiety as a problem to be solved and started understanding it as a window into what makes us most deeply human. But understanding the mechanism was only the beginning. The real question was what to do about it. To understand why your heart races before a presentation, you must first understand what it meant to be human 50,000 years ago. I spent months after my revelation, with Patient 347, immersed in paleoanthropology texts, studying fossil records and archaeological evidence that painted a picture radically different from our modern reality. The fossilized skull I keep on my desk, a replica of Homo erectus remains dating back 1.8 million years, serves as a constant reminder of how recently we acquired the complex social structures that define our species. Early humans lived in small bands of 20 to 50 individuals. These groups moved constantly, following game and seasonal resources across vast territories. Most importantly, they depended on each other for everything: food procurement, shelter construction, child care, protection from predators, and rival groups. The archaeological record tells a stark story about individual survival outside these groups. Isolated human remains from prehistoric sites show clear evidence of what happened to those separated from their tribes: death by starvation, predation, or exposure within days. No tools, no fire-making materials, no weapons suitable for solo hunting. Early humans were physically weak compared to other predators, with no natural defenses except intelligence and cooperation. This reality shaped our psychology in ways we are only beginning to understand. Consider what social rejection meant in that environment. If your behavior offended the group, if you were perceived as selfish, unreliable, or dangerous, exile was not just punishment, it was a death sentence. Your genes would disappear from the population. Your lineage would end. Natural selection is ruthlessly efficient. Over thousands of generations, it favored individuals with an intense, visceral fear of group disapproval, those who could accurately read social cues, who felt genuine terror at the prospect of rejection, who would do anything to maintain their standing within the tribe. They survived. They reproduced. They passed on their genes. The indifferent ones, the socially oblivious ones, the ones who could not sense when the group was turning against them, their bones scattered across prehistoric landscapes, picked clean by scavengers. This is why your body treats a boardroom presentation like a life or death situation, because for your ancestors, social evaluation literally was life or death. The mechanisms that kept early humans alive became increasingly sophisticated as our social structures grew more complex. Archaeological evidence from sites like Göbekli Tepe, dating back 11,000 years, shows that humans were already organizing in hierarchical societies with complex ritual and status systems. The ability to navigate these hierarchies, to read group dynamics, to maintain social standing, these became survival skills as critical as hunting or fire-making. But here is what most people do not understand. The fear was not just about rejection. It was about judgment itself. In small prehistoric groups, everyone knew everyone. Your reputation was your most valuable asset. If you demonstrated poor judgment, cowardice, or incompetence, That information spread instantly through the entire community. There were no second chances, no opportunities to reinvent yourself with a different group. Your social identity was permanent and public. This created enormous selective pressure for individuals who were acutely sensitive to being evaluated by others, not just fear of negative judgment, but intense awareness of being watched, assessed, measured against group standards. The very act of being the focus of group attention triggered survival alertness. Think about what this means for public speaking. When you stand before an audience, you are not just communicating information, you are submitting yourself to the most ancient form of social evaluation that exists. Every person in that audience is, from your primitive brain's perspective, a tribal member whose opinion could determine your survival. The larger the audience, the higher the stakes. The more important the audience members, the greater the perceived threat. Your nervous system responds accordingly, flooding your body with stress hormones designed to help you either fight for your place in the group or flee to avoid rejection. But modern public speaking allows neither fight nor flight. You must stand there, exposed and vulnerable, while your body prepares for physical combat or rapid escape. The evolutionary logic becomes even clearer when you examine the specific physical symptoms of speaking anxiety. Sweating helps regulate body temperature during physical exertion. Increased heart rate pumps blood to major muscle groups. Heightened alertness sharpens focus on potential threats. Muscle tension prepares for explosive movement. These responses make perfect sense if you are about to defend your position in a hostile tribal confrontation. They are counterproductive if you are trying to deliver a calm, articulate presentation about quarterly. We literally evolved larger brains primarily to navigate increasingly complex social relationships. The ability to understand group dynamics, predict social consequences, and modify behavior to maintain tribal acceptance became our species' most distinctive survival advantage. This is why the most intelligent, socially aware individuals often struggle most with speaking anxiety. Their brains are doing exactly what evolution designed them to do, accurately assessing social threats and responding with appropriate caution. The fact that modern presentations rarely involve actual exile or death is irrelevant to neural circuits that have been refined over millions of years. Understanding this evolutionary foundation does not immediately cure speaking anxiety, but it does something equally important. It reframes the experience from personal weakness to biological inheritance. The terror you feel before speaking is not evidence of inadequacy. It is evidence that you carry within you the successful survival strategies of countless ancestors who lived to reproduce because they took social evaluation seriously. Your fear connects you to an unbroken chain of humans who survived because they understood at the deepest level that the opinion of the group could mean the difference between life and death. In our modern world, we have forgotten this connection. We think of speaking anxiety as an irrational response to a harmless situation, but your body remembers what your mind has forgotten, that being judged by others is one of the most dangerous experiences a human can face. The fMRI brain scan hanging in my office shows something remarkable, 2 images side by side, both from the same research subject. The first captures brain activity while the person experiences physical pain from a controlled heat stimulus. The second shows the same brain during social rejection being excluded from a simple computer game by other participants. The patterns are nearly identical. This 2003 study revolutionized our understanding of why social rejection hurts so much. The anterior cingulate cortex, a region that processes physical pain, lights up with the same intensity whether you are touching a hot stove or being snubbed by a group. Your brain literally cannot distinguish between social and physical injury. This discovery explains something I had observed for years in my practice but never fully understood. Patients would describe speaking anxiety using the language of physical trauma. It feels like I'm being attacked, or like someone punched me in the stomach, or I thought I was having a heart attack. They were not being metaphorical. Their brains were processing the threat of social judgment as if it were physical violence. To understand how this happens, you must map the neural pathways that create speaking anxiety. The process begins before you even step onto the stage, sometimes days in advance. When you first learn about an upcoming presentation, your prefrontal cortex, the rational planning part of your brain, begins assessing the situation. This assessment includes estimating the audience size, their importance to your career or social standing, the potential consequences of a poor performance, and your level of preparation. If this rational evaluation concludes that the stakes are high and the outcome uncertain, it sends signals to deeper, more primitive brain structures. This is where the trouble begins. The amygdala, an almond-shaped cluster of neurons buried deep in your temporal lobe, serves as your brain's alarm system. It has been scanning for threats continuously since before you were born, and it operates on a simple principle: when in doubt, assume danger and respond immediately. The amygdala cannot distinguish between a charging lion and a critical audience. Both represent potential threats to your survival, so both trigger the same response cascade. Within milliseconds of detecting social threat, the amygdala activates your sympathetic nervous system and begins flooding your body with stress hormones. First comes norepinephrine, which increases heart rate and blood pressure while sharpening focus. This is why your pulse quickens when you think about your upcoming presentation. Your cardiovascular system is preparing for physical exertion. Next comes epinephrine adrenaline, which mobilizes energy stores and heightens alertness. This creates the jittery, hypervigilant feeling that makes it difficult to concentrate on anything except the approaching threat. Finally, your adrenal glands release cortisol, the primary stress hormone. Cortisol serves many functions, but its most relevant effect for speaking anxiety is its impact on memory and executive function. Moderate levels enhance performance, but high levels, the kind triggered by perceived social threats, impair your ability to access stored information and think clearly. This is why your mind goes blank during presentations, even when you know the material perfectly. The stress response designed to help you survive physical threats actively interferes with the cognitive functions required for effective communication. The hippocampus, which helps form and retrieve memories, becomes less efficient under cortisol's influence. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for working memory and executive control, gets overwhelmed by signals from the amygdala. Meanwhile, your attention narrows to focus exclusively on threat-related information, the expressions on audience faces, signs of disapproval or boredom, potential evidence that you are failing. But the neurological hijacking goes deeper than conscious awareness. Your autonomic nervous system, which controls involuntary functions like breathing and digestion, shifts into survival mode without any input from your conscious mind. Blood flow redirects from your digestive system to major muscle groups, creating the nauseous, hollow feeling in your stomach. Your breathing becomes shallow and rapid, reducing carbon dioxide levels in your blood and creating dizziness or lightheadedness. Your muscles tense in preparation for action, causing trembling and stiffness. Your voice changes because the muscles controlling your larynx and vocal cords are affected by the same tension that grips your entire body. The higher pitch, the tremor, the occasional crack. These are not signs of weakness. They are evidence that your body is preparing for a life-threatening confrontation. Perhaps most frustratingly, this entire cascade happens automatically and unconsciously. By the time you notice your heart racing or your palms sweating, the neurochemical process is already well underway. Your rational mind, the part of you that knows the presentation is harmless, becomes a helpless observer to your body's emergency response. This is why logical self-talk rarely helps with speaking anxiety. When someone tells you to just relax or don't be nervous, they are essentially asking your amygdala to ignore millions of years of evolutionary programming. Your rational brain agrees with their advice, but your survival circuits are not listening to your rational brain. They are responding to perceived social threat with appropriate urgency. The neurological machinery becomes even more complex when you consider the role of anticipatory anxiety. Your brain's prediction systems, designed to help you prepare for future challenges, begin imagining negative outcomes days or weeks before your presentation. Each time you visualize failure, embarrassment, or rejection, your amygdala responds as if the threat were immediate and real. This creates a feedback loop. Anticipatory anxiety triggers stress responses, which feel unpleasant, which increases your dread about the upcoming event, which triggers more anticipatory anxiety. The result is that many people experience their worst speaking anxiety not during the actual presentation, but in the days leading up to it. Your brain is essentially torturing you with imaginary social rejection, then using your distress about that imaginary rejection as evidence that the real event will be traumatic. Modern neuroscience has also revealed why some people seem naturally comfortable with public speaking, while others struggle intensely. Individual differences in amygdala sensitivity, cortisol production, and prefrontal cortex regulation create vastly different responses to social evaluation. Some people have naturally less reactive amygdalas, or more efficient prefrontal cortex control systems. These individuals can stand before large audiences and feel only mild activation of their threat detection systems. Their bodies produce enough stress hormones to maintain alertness without triggering the full survival response. Others, often those with higher intelligence and greater social sensitivity, have more reactive neural systems. Their brains are better at detecting subtle social cues and potential threats, which made them more likely to survive in ancestral environments, but creates difficulties in modern presentation contexts. Understanding this neurological machinery reveals why speaking anxiety feels so overwhelming and why it resists simple solutions. You are not fighting a bad habit or irrational fear. You are working against millions of years of neural programming designed to keep you alive in social situations that could determine your survival. Your brain is doing exactly what it is supposed to do when faced with potential social evaluation and rejection. The fact that modern audiences rarely pose actual survival threats is irrelevant to neural circuits that evolved when social judgment literally meant the difference between life and death. The television camera equipment sitting in my office dates back to the 1950s, when mass media first made it possible for a single person to address millions of strangers simultaneously. This bulky, primitive device represents a turning point in human history, the moment when our ancient social fears encountered unprecedented amplification. For millions of years, the largest audience any human could address was perhaps a few hundred people gathered around a tribal fire. Your reputation could spread only as far as word of mouth could travel, which meant your mistakes were contained within a relatively small community. If you embarrassed yourself spectacularly, you might become the subject of local gossip for a generation, but your failure would not echo across continents or persist indefinitely in recorded form. Modern technology changed everything. Today, a single poorly received speech can be viewed by millions on social media, dissected by strangers, turned into memes that outlive the speaker. Your worst moment can achieve permanent global visibility. The stakes that our brains are wired to fear widespread social rejection and lasting damage to reputation are no longer theoretical possibilities. They are documented realities that happen to ordinary people every day. This technological amplification explains why speaking anxiety has reached epidemic proportions in developed societies. We have created a world where the consequences our ancient fear systems were designed to prevent can actually occur, but on a scale that would have been unimaginable to our ancestors. Consider what this means for your nervous system. When you step before a modern audience, your amygdala is not just responding to the immediate threat of rejection by the people in front of you, it is responding to the possibility that your performance could be recorded, shared, commented upon, and preserved indefinitely by unknown numbers of judges. The contrast with ancestral environments is stark. Early humans lived in societies where everyone knew everyone, where relationships were stable and enduring, where social mistakes could be addressed through direct conversation and community integration. If you offended someone, you could work to repair the relationship because you would see that person regularly for the rest of your life. Modern audiences consist largely of strangers who will judge you once and never interact with you again. There is no opportunity for relationship repair, no chance to demonstrate growth or change, no possibility of the kind of social reconciliation that our brains are wired to seek after conflict or rejection. This creates a perfect storm for anxiety. Your primitive social circuits detect high stakes and no clear path to resolution, triggering maximum alertness and fear. The situation becomes even more complex when you consider how modern professional success depends on skills our ancestors rarely needed. In hunter-gatherer societies, survival depended on physical abilities, practical knowledge, and maintaining relationships within a small group. Public oratory was not a daily requirement. Today, career advancement in most fields requires the ability to present ideas effectively to groups of relative strangers. Performance reviews, client presentations, conference speeches, team meetings, modern professional life is structured around repeated exposure to the exact situations that trigger our deepest social fears. We have created a society that rewards the very behavior our survival instincts are designed to avoid. This paradox affects some people more than others, and the pattern reveals something important about who struggles most with speaking anxiety. The individuals who experience the most intense fear are often those whose careers depend most heavily on maintaining professional reputation and social standing. Executives, academics, consultants, lawyers, people whose income and identity are tied to being perceived as competent and articulate face the highest stakes when speaking publicly. Their primitive brains correctly recognize that poor performance could indeed threaten their survival in modern terms: loss of income, professional standing, social status, and access to resources. The anxiety is not irrational. The consequences are real. Social media has added another layer of amplification that our ancestors could never have imagined. A single awkward moment during a presentation can now be captured, edited, and distributed to audiences of unprecedented size within hours. The tribal shame that might once have affected a few dozen people can now reach millions. More insidiously, social media creates the impression that everyone else is perfectly comfortable with public attention. We see carefully curated presentations, polished speeches, and confident performances without witnessing the preparation, anxiety, or failed attempts that preceded them. This creates unrealistic expectations and increases the pressure to appear naturally comfortable with public speaking. The modern workplace has also eliminated many of the buffers that once protected people from direct social evaluation. Traditional hierarchical structures meant that most employees rarely presented to senior leadership or external audiences. Middle management filtered information and represented their teams in high-stakes presentations. Today's flatter organizational structures expect individual contributors to present directly to executives, clients, and large groups. The protective layers have been stripped away, exposing more people to the kind of high-stakes social evaluation that was once limited to tribal leaders and shamans. Remote work and video conferencing have introduced new variables that further complicate the social evaluation process. Speaking to a camera creates a strange psychological disconnect where you cannot read audience reactions or receive the kind of immediate feedback that would help your nervous system calibrate threat levels. The absence of normal social cues makes your brain default to assuming the worst. The global nature of modern business means that presentations often involve cultural differences that add layers of uncertainty to social evaluation. When you cannot predict how your message will be received by audiences from different cultural backgrounds, your threat detection systems become hypervigilant. Professional training and education have also created unrealistic expectations about speaking competence. We teach presentation skills as if they were purely technical abilities that can be mastered through practice and preparation. This ignores the powerful biological forces at work and creates shame around natural adaptive responses to social threat. When someone struggles with speaking anxiety despite extensive training and preparation, they often conclude that they are uniquely flawed or weak. The reality is that they are responding normally to artificial situations that trigger ancient survival mechanisms. The pharmaceutical industry has both recognized and capitalized on this modern amplification. Beta blockers, originally developed for heart conditions, are now commonly prescribed for speaking anxiety because they block the physical symptoms of the stress response. Anti-anxiety medications are routinely used by professionals who must present regularly. This medical approach acknowledges that speaking anxiety is not simply a matter of confidence or preparation. It is a physiological response that can be addressed through biological intervention. However, it also treats the symptoms rather than addressing the fundamental mismatch between our evolutionary programming and modern social demands. The entertainment industry has perhaps contributed most significantly to unrealistic expectations about public speaking. Movies and television portray spontaneous, eloquent speeches delivered under pressure by characters who show no signs of anxiety or preparation. These fictional models create impossible standards that make normal human responses to social evaluation seem pathological. Real public speaking involves preparation, nervousness, mistakes, and gradual improvement over time. But media representation suggests that compelling communication should flow naturally from confident, charismatic individuals who never experience fear or uncertainty. Understanding this modern amplification helps explain why speaking anxiety has become so prevalent despite humanity's long history of oral communication. We are not dealing with the same social environment that shaped our psychological responses. We have created artificial conditions that trigger ancient fears while removing the social support systems that once helped people navigate group evaluation. The fear you feel before speaking is not evidence of personal inadequacy. It is evidence that your brain is correctly assessing a situation that would have been genuinely dangerous for most of human history and remains potentially threatening in our interconnected, recorded, judgment-heavy modern world. Your ancestors feared social rejection because it meant death. You fear social rejection because it can still mean professional death, social isolation, and loss of the resources and relationships you need to thrive. The difference is not in the reality of the threat. It is in the scale and permanence of the consequences. The emergency room chart from 1987 tells a story that repeats itself in hospitals across the world every day. A 34-year-old man, previously healthy, rushed to the ER during his brother's wedding reception. Chief complaint: chest pain, difficulty breathing, racing heart, dizziness, and a crushing sense of impending doom. He was convinced he was having a heart attack. The medical workup was extensive. EKG, blood tests, chest x-rays, everything came back normal. His heart was fine. His lungs were clear. His blood chemistry showed no signs of cardiac distress or other medical emergency. What had happened was simpler and more common than anyone realized. He had been asked to give an impromptu toast at his brother's wedding. His body's response to this social threat was so intense that he mistook it for a life-threatening medical event. This case illustrates one of the most misunderstood aspects of speaking anxiety. The physical symptoms are not proportional to the actual danger, but they are perfectly proportional to the perceived threat as interpreted by your ancient survival systems. When I explain this to patients, I often use the medical chart as a teaching tool. Every symptom this man experienced represents your body's intelligent preparation for a physical confrontation that was never going to occur. The chest pain came from muscles tensing across his ribcage and shoulders. When your nervous system prepares for combat, it activates muscle groups throughout your upper body. This creates pressure and tightness that can feel identical to cardiac distress, especially when combined with rapid breathing and increased heart rate. The racing heart was his cardiovascular system responding to norepinephrine and epinephrine stress hormones that increase cardiac output to pump blood to major muscle groups. In a physical confrontation, this would provide the energy needed for fighting or fleeing. During a wedding toast, it creates the uncomfortable sensation that your heart might burst from your chest. His difficulty breathing resulted from his respiratory rate increasing to provide more oxygen to muscles preparing for exertion. This hyperventilation reduces carbon dioxide levels in the blood, creating dizziness, lightheadedness, and the feeling that you cannot catch your breath no matter how much air you take in. The sense of impending doom, perhaps the most unsettling symptom, comes directly from your amygdala's threat assessment. This brain structure evolved to create powerful negative emotions that would motivate immediate action in dangerous situations. The feeling that something terrible is about to happen is your ancient alarm system working exactly as designed. What makes these symptoms so distressing is not just their intensity, but their apparent disconnection from the triggering situation. Your rational mind knows that giving a toast at a wedding poses no physical threat. Yet your body responds as if you are facing a life or death confrontation. This creates a secondary layer of anxiety. You become afraid of your own fear response. I have treated countless patients who developed what I call symptom anxiety, fear of experiencing the physical manifestations of speaking anxiety. They avoid presentations not just because of social fear, but because they dread the racing heart, sweating, trembling, and nausea that accompany their speaking anxiety. This creates a vicious cycle. Anticipating these uncomfortable symptoms increases overall anxiety about speaking, which intensifies the symptoms when they occur, which reinforces the desire to avoid speaking situations entirely. Understanding the evolutionary logic behind each symptom can help break this cycle. Your body is not malfunctioning, it is responding appropriately to what your brain has identified as a survival threat. The trembling in your hands and voice comes from muscle tension and adrenaline preparing your body for precise, rapid movements. In a physical confrontation, this neuromuscular activation would enhance your ability to fight effectively or escape quickly. The same physiological preparation that would make you faster and stronger in actual danger makes you shake when trying to hold a microphone steady. The sweating serves multiple functions in emergency situations. It helps regulate body temperature during intense physical activity and creates a slippery surface that makes you harder for attackers to grip. These advantages are irrelevant during presentations, but your sweat glands do not distinguish between social and physical threats. Your voice changes becoming higher, tighter, or more breathy, because the muscles controlling your larynx and vocal cords are affected by the same tension that grips your entire body. Additionally, your breathing pattern changes under stress, reducing the airflow needed for strong, resonant vocal production. The digestive symptoms, nausea, stomach pain, or the urgent need for a bathroom occur because your body shuts down non-essential functions during emergencies. Digesting food requires significant energy that could be better used for survival activities. Your gastrointestinal system essentially pauses until the perceived threat has passed. Perhaps most frustratingly, your mind can go completely blank even when you know your material perfectly. This happens because high levels of cortisol and other stress hormones interfere with memory retrieval and executive function. Your brain prioritizes threat detection over information processing, making it difficult to access stored knowledge or think clearly about complex topics. These cognitive effects explain why traditional preparation often fails to reduce speaking anxiety. You can rehearse your presentation hundreds of times, but if your stress response is activated during the actual event, you may not be able to access the information you practiced. The harder you try to remember your prepared remarks, the more frustrated you become, which increases stress and further impairs memory function. The timing of symptoms also confuses many people. Some experience their worst anxiety days before a presentation, while others feel fine until the moment they step onto the stage. Some have intense physical symptoms with relatively mild emotional distress, while others experience overwhelming psychological terror with few physical manifestations. These variations reflect individual differences in nervous system sensitivity, stress hormone production, and cognitive processing styles. There is no correct way to experience speaking anxiety, and the absence of certain symptoms does not mean your fear is less valid or your response less normal. One of the most misunderstood aspects of speaking symptoms is their persistence after the presentation ends. Many people expect immediate relief once they finish speaking, but the stress hormone cascade can take hours to fully resolve. Cortisol, in particular, remains elevated for extended periods after the triggering event has passed. This explains why you might feel emotionally and physically drained for the rest of the day after a significant presentation, even if it went well. Your body's been running an emergency response system that consumes tremendous amounts of energy and resources. The exhaustion you feel afterward is real and warranted. The symptoms can also intensify with repeated exposure if the underlying anxiety is not addressed. Each negative experience with public speaking creates associative memories that your brain uses to predict future outcomes. If previous presentations were accompanied by intense physical discomfort, your nervous system learns to anticipate and prepare for similar distress in future speaking situations. This is why exposure therapy alone, simply forcing yourself to speak publicly more often, sometimes backfires. Without addressing the underlying threat interpretation, repeated exposure can actually strengthen the neural pathways that connect public speaking with danger signals. Medical professionals often misunderstand speaking anxiety symptoms because they appear during routine, non-threatening situations. Emergency room doctors see patients convinced they are dying, only to discover that the trigger was a work presentation or social event. This can lead to dismissive attitudes that minimize the genuine distress these individuals experience. The symptoms are real, even if the threat is not immediate or physical. Your body is responding to perceived social danger with the same biological systems that would activate during actual physical peril. The fact that the danger is social rather than physical does not make the stress response less intense or the symptoms less valid. Understanding this distinction is crucial for developing effective coping strategies. You cannot simply will away symptoms that are generated by automatic biological processes, but you can learn to work with these processes rather than against them. The first step is recognizing that your symptoms represent ancient wisdom applied to modern situations. Your body is trying to protect you using strategies that kept your ancestors alive. The mismatch is not in your response, it is between the situations that shaped your nervous system and the contexts in which you now find yourself. When you understand that your racing heart, sweating palms, and shaking voice are evidence of a sophisticated survival system rather than personal weakness, you can begin to develop a different relationship with your speaking anxiety symptoms. The handwritten speech notes in my office belong to one of history's greatest orators, yet they tell a story that would surprise most people. The margins are filled with anxious scribbles, timing marks, and what appear to be breathing reminders. Small stains suggest sweaty palms grip these pages during preparation. These are Winston Churchill's personal speaking notes, and they reveal a man who struggled intensely, with the very skill that defined his legacy. Churchill once wrote, "A man's reputation is like his shadow, gigantic when it follows, diminishing when it precedes." His private correspondence reveals that he spent hours preparing even short remarks, rehearsed obsessively in front of mirrors, and experienced severe anxiety before important speeches. The man who rallied Britain through its darkest hour with his eloquence was terrified of public speaking for much of his life. This paradox appears repeatedly throughout history, and in my clinical practice, the people who struggle most with speaking anxiety are often those who are most accomplished, intelligent, and successful in other areas of their lives. The relationship between competence and speaking anxiety is counterintuitive, but consistent. High achievers frequently experience more intense presentation anxiety than average performers, not less. This pattern initially puzzled me until I understood the evolutionary logic behind it. Successful people have more to lose. When you have built a reputation for excellence, every public presentation becomes a high-stakes performance where failure could damage carefully constructed professional identity. Your primitive brain correctly recognizes that poor speaking performance could threaten the social status and resources you have worked years to accumulate. A mediocre employee giving a poor presentation might face mild embarrassment. A senior executive, renowned expert, or respected professional giving the same poor presentation could see their reputation, credibility, and career prospects suffer lasting damage. The stakes are genuinely higher, so the fear response is proportionally more intense. This explains why many of my most anxious patients are individuals who command respect in their fields. I have treated surgeons who perform complex operations without hesitation but panic before medical conferences. Trial lawyers who are fearless in courtrooms but terrified of speaking at professional gatherings. CEOs who make multi-million-dollar decisions confidently but become physically ill before board presentations. Their anxiety is not irrational, it is a realistic assessment of what they have at risk. The imposter syndrome connection deepens this paradox. High achievers often harbor secret fears that their success is undeserved, or that they will be exposed as frauds. Public speaking creates exactly the kind of scrutiny they most fear: extended evaluation by knowledgeable peers who might detect their supposed inadequacy. The more successful you become, the more you attract audiences capable of sophisticated judgment. A beginning professional might present to colleagues with similar experience levels. A recognized expert faces audiences that include other experts, competitors, and critics who are specifically looking for flaws in reasoning or gaps in knowledge. This creates a cruel irony. Expertise makes you a target for more sophisticated evaluation, which triggers more intense anxiety responses. Intelligence amplifies the problem rather than solving it. Highly intelligent individuals are better at imagining potential failure scenarios, anticipating hostile questions, and recognizing the many ways a presentation could go wrong. Their cognitive abilities, which serve them well in most situations, become liability when applied to anxiety-provoking future events. I have observed that patients with higher IQs often experience more elaborate and detailed anxiety about speaking. They do not just fear general embarrassment. They construct specific, vivid scenarios of professional humiliation complete with potential consequences for their careers, relationships, and self-worth. Their intelligence also makes them acutely aware of their own anxiety symptoms, creating the secondary anxiety I mentioned earlier. They notice their racing heart, analyze their shallow breathing, become conscious of their trembling voice, and interpret these symptoms as evidence of impending failure. Average performers might experience the same physiological responses but be less aware of them or less skilled at predicting their implications. High achievers monitor themselves constantly, turning natural stress responses into additional sources of anxiety. The perfectionism common among successful people creates another layer of speaking difficulty. Perfectionists set unrealistic standards for their presentation performance, expecting flawless delivery, profound insights, and universal audience approval. When inevitable human imperfections appear, a stumbled word, a moment of uncertainty, a question they cannot answer perfectly, they interpret these normal occurrences as catastrophic failures. This perfectionist mindset also makes preparation more anxiety-provoking rather than reassuring. Instead of reducing uncertainty, extensive preparation reveals all the potential problems, unanswered questions, and areas where their knowledge might be insufficient. The more they prepare, the more aware they become of everything that could go wrong. Professional success often requires developing a public persona that may differ significantly from one's private personality. Executives learn to project confidence, experts cultivate authoritative demeanors, leaders present themselves as decisive and certain. Public speaking threatens to reveal the uncertainty, self-doubt, and humanity that successful people learn to keep hidden. The fear is not just about speaking poorly, it is about the audience seeing through their professional facade to the vulnerable, uncertain person underneath. This explains why many accomplished individuals feel more anxious about informal speaking situations than formal presentations. A structured presentation allows them to maintain their professional persona through careful preparation and controlled delivery. Spontaneous speaking, question and answer sessions, or casual remarks create opportunities for their authentic, less polished selves to emerge. The networking and relationship aspects of professional success also increase speaking anxiety. Successful people often have extensive professional networks where reputation spreads quickly. A poor presentation does not just affect the immediate audience. It can damage relationships and opportunities throughout their entire professional ecosystem. They understand correctly that their professional networks are built on perceptions of competence and expertise. Speaking anxiety stems partly from realistic concern about protecting these valuable relationships and the opportunities they create. The responsibility burden adds another dimension to the paradox. Successful people often speak not just for themselves, but on behalf of their organizations, teams, or areas of expertise. The weight of representing others' interests and maintaining institutional credibility creates additional pressure beyond personal reputation concerns. A junior employee presenting their own work faces relatively contained consequences. A department head presenting to senior leadership carries responsibility for their entire team's reputation. An expert speaking at conferences represents their entire field of study. The scope of potential impact expands with professional success, creating proportionally greater anxiety. This responsibility dimension explains why the same person might feel comfortable speaking about personal topics but anxious when representing professional interests. The stakes and scope of potential consequences are fundamentally different. The competitive nature of high achievement environments also intensifies speaking anxiety. Successful people often work in contexts where colleagues are simultaneously allies and competitors. Presentations become not just information sharing, but competitive displays where weaknesses can be exploited by rivals. This competitive element transforms speaking from communication into performance art, where the audience includes people actively looking for signs of weakness or vulnerability they might use for their own advancement. Time pressure compounds these challenges. Successful people typically have demanding schedules that leave little time for the extensive preparation their perfectionist tendencies demand. They know how much preparation would be required for them to feel truly confident, but they cannot invest that time without neglecting other important responsibilities. This creates a perpetual state of feeling underprepared, which feeds directly into anxiety about potential failure or exposure of inadequacy. Understanding the successful person's paradox is crucial for developing effective approaches to speaking anxiety. The fear experienced by high achievers is not evidence of weakness or inadequate preparation. It is a rational response to genuinely high stakes combined with sophisticated threat assessment capabilities. Traditional advice about building confidence or focusing on the audience's needs often misses the mark, because it fails to acknowledge the real risks these individuals face. Their anxiety is not based on irrational fears, but on accurate assessment of what they have to lose and the sophistication of the evaluation they will receive. The solution is not to minimize their concerns, but to develop strategies that account for the legitimate challenges they face while working with, rather than against their evolutionary threat detection systems. The ancient Greek amphitheater plan spread across my desk reveals something remarkable about how our ancestors understood audience psychology. The theater of Epidaurus, built in the 4th century BCE, was designed with acoustic principles that allowed every audience member to hear clearly while creating an intimate connection between speaker and listeners despite the massive size. But more importantly for our purposes, these architects understood something we have forgotten. The physical environment can either support or sabotage the speaker's nervous system. The semicircular design ensured that speakers could see their entire audience, allowing them to read facial expressions and gauge reactions. The elevated stage provided natural authority while keeping the speaker within conversational distance of front-row listeners. Even the materials limestone that absorbed harsh echoes while amplifying the human voice were chosen to support rather than challenge the speaker. These ancient designers worked with human psychology rather than against it. Modern approaches to speaking anxiety too often try to overcome evolutionary programming instead of channeling it productively. After 3 decades of treating speaking anxiety, I have learned that the most effective solutions acknowledge our ancient wiring while providing practical tools for managing modern presentation challenges. You cannot eliminate the fear response, nor should you want to, since it serves important functions, but you can learn to work with it. The first principle is understanding that your goal is not fearlessness, but functional fear management. The stress response that creates speaking anxiety also provides energy, focus, and heightened awareness that can enhance performance when properly channeled. Complete elimination of pre-speaking nerves often correlates with flat, unengaging presentations. The key is shifting your nervous system from emergency response to optimal performance zone, maintaining alertness and energy while avoiding the cognitive impairment that comes with extreme anxiety. This begins with reframing your relationship to the physical symptoms. Instead of interpreting your racing heart as evidence of danger, recognize it as your body providing extra energy for the task ahead. Instead of seeing trembling as weakness, understand it as neuromuscular preparation for precise action. This reframing is not simply positive thinking, it is based on understanding the actual function of these responses. When you stop fighting your body's preparation and start working with it, the symptoms often become less intrusive and sometimes even helpful. Breathing techniques work not because deep breathing is inherently calming, but because controlled breathing gives your prefrontal cortex something to focus on besides threat assessment. When you concentrate on specific breathing patterns, you interrupt the worry cycles that escalate anxiety and provide your rational mind with a concrete task it can manage successfully. The most effective breathing pattern I have found involves inhaling for 4 counts, holding for 4 counts, exhaling for 6 counts, and holding empty for 2 counts. This pattern reduces carbon dioxide levels gradually rather than through the rapid, shallow breathing that creates dizziness and panic. Physical preparation extends beyond breathing to include progressive muscle relaxation, particularly for the muscle groups most affected by speaking anxiety. Systematic tension and release of shoulder, neck, and jaw muscles can prevent the building tension that creates trembling and voice changes. However, these physical techniques are most effective when combined with cognitive strategies that address the underlying threat interpretation driving the anxiety response. Visualization works, but not in the way most people practice it. Simply imagining successful presentations is less effective than rehearsing specific challenge scenarios and your responses to them. Your brain needs to practice not just success, but recovery from mistakes, handling hostile questions, and managing unexpected situations. This type of scenario-based visualization provides your nervous system with alternative response patterns beyond the basic fight-flight-freeze options. When you have mentally rehearsed handling interruptions, equipment failures, or challenging questions, your brain has established neural pathways for managing these situations calmly. The most powerful visualization technique involves imagining the audience as your tribal supporters rather than potential threats. This requires understanding that most audiences want you to succeed, not fail. They have invested time to hear your message and hope to gain valuable information or insights. Their attention represents interest, not hostility. Preparation strategies must account for the way stress affects memory and cognitive function. Over-preparation can increase anxiety by revealing too many potential problems, while under-preparation leaves you vulnerable to the mind blanks that occur under pressure. The optimal approach involves preparing core messages so thoroughly that you can deliver them even when your higher cognitive functions are impaired by stress. This means practicing key points until they become automatic, creating multiple pathways to the same information, and building in recovery strategies for when you lose your train of thought. I recommend the grandmother test for preparation. You should be able to explain your main points clearly to someone with no background knowledge while you are distracted or under mild stress. This level of internalization provides confidence that you can communicate effectively even when anxiety impairs your normal thinking processes. Gradual exposure remains one of the most effective long-term strategies, but it must be done systematically within supportive contexts. Random, high-stakes speaking experiences can reinforce rather than reduce anxiety by confirming your nervous system's assessment that public speaking is dangerous. Effective exposure begins with low-stakes situations where failure would have minimal consequences. Speaking to small groups of supportive colleagues, participating in Toastmasters meetings, or presenting at informal gatherings allows you to experience the fear response without catastrophic outcomes. The key is ensuring that these early experiences provide evidence that contradicts your threat assessment rather than confirms it. Each successful speaking experience teaches your nervous system that social evaluation can be survived and even beneficial. Creating artificial tribal connections with your audience can significantly reduce the threat response. This involves arriving early to meet audience members individually, learning about their backgrounds and interests, and establishing personal connections before you begin presenting. When you know specific individuals in your audience, even briefly, your primitive brain is more likely to interpret them as potential allies rather than anonymous threats. This transforms the dynamic from one person facing a potentially hostile group to one tribal member sharing information with other tribal members. Physical positioning and movement also affect your nervous system's threat assessment. Standing behind podiums or lecterns can increase feelings of vulnerability by creating barriers between you and the audience while limiting your movement options. Moving closer to the audience when possible often reduces rather than increases anxiety by creating more natural conversational dynamics. The room setup significantly impacts your comfort level. Classroom-style seating with audience members facing forward in rows creates a more formal, evaluative atmosphere than circular or U-shaped arrangements that encourage interaction and connection. When you have control over the environment, choose arrangements that support rather than challenge your nervous system. This might mean requesting smaller rooms that create intimacy, ensuring good lighting so you can see audience faces, or asking for wireless microphones that allow natural movement. Technology can either support or sabotage your speaking experience. Unfamiliar presentation software, untested microphones, or complex visual aids create additional variables that your already alert nervous system must monitor. The more unknowns you eliminate in advance, the more mental resources you can devote to your actual message. Recovery strategies are as important as prevention techniques. When anxiety symptoms appear during presentations, having predetermined responses prevents panic about the symptoms themselves. Simple techniques like pausing to take a sip of water, acknowledging nervousness briefly and naturally, or asking the audience a question can provide moments to regain composure without calling attention to your distress. The most important recovery strategy is self-compassion. When mistakes happen, and they will, treating yourself with the same kindness you would offer a friend prevents the secondary anxiety that often creates more problems than the original error. Long-term anxiety management involves building tolerance for uncertainty and imperfection, rather than trying to eliminate all possibilities of failure. This means practicing speaking when you are not perfectly prepared, intentionally making small mistakes to learn that recovery is possible, and gradually increasing the stakes of your speaking experiences as your confidence grows. Working with speaking anxiety is ultimately about changing your relationship with social evaluation rather than avoiding it. The goal is not to eliminate the ancient wisdom that makes you alert to social threats, but to calibrate it appropriately for modern contexts, where the consequences of rejection are rarely life-threatening. Understanding that your fear represents millions of years of successful survival strategy can transform your relationship with speaking anxiety from shame and frustration to appreciation and skillful management. You are not broken. You are responding normally to artificial situations that trigger natural protective mechanisms. The techniques that work best are those that honor this evolutionary inheritance, while providing practical tools for thriving in modern presentation contexts. The neurofeedback device on my desk represents the latest frontier in understanding our own minds. This small electronic instrument can monitor brain activity in real time, showing exactly what happens in different regions when someone experiences social stress. What it reveals about speaking anxiety has fundamentally changed how I understand this ancient fear. Watching the brain activity patterns of my patients during simulated speaking scenarios, I see something remarkable. The same neural networks that activate during intense fear also light up during moments of deep empathy, social connection, and emotional resonance with others. The brain regions most involved in speaking anxiety, the anterior cingulate cortex, the insula, the amygdala, are also the primary centers for social cognition, emotional intelligence, and the ability to understand and respond to others' mental states. This is not a coincidence. The capacity to feel intense anxiety about social rejection and the ability to form deep emotional connections with others spring from the same neurological source. Your speaking anxiety is not evidence of social dysfunction. It is evidence of highly developed social sensitivity. This realization has transformed my understanding of who struggles most with speaking anxiety and why. The patients who experience the most intense fear before presentations are often those who demonstrate the greatest empathy, emotional intelligence, and concern for others' well-being in their daily lives. They are not socially impaired, they are socially hyper-aware. Their nervous systems are finely tuned to detect subtle changes in others' emotions, to anticipate social needs, and to respond sensitively to group dynamics. These same capabilities that make them excellent friends, partners, and colleagues also make them acutely vulnerable to the fear of social rejection. I have learned to see speaking anxiety as a strength that has been misapplied rather than a weakness to be overcome. The biological systems that create this fear evolved because they served crucial functions in maintaining group cohesion and ensuring individual survival within social structures. Your ancestors who were most sensitive to social cues, most concerned about group harmony, most motivated to avoid rejection, they were also the ones most likely to build strong alliances, maintain tribal unity, and create the cooperative relationships that allowed early human societies to thrive. The fear you feel before speaking is not separate from your capacity for love, friendship, and social connection. It is the shadow side of the same psychological systems that make deep relationships possible. This perspective reframes everything about how we should approach speaking anxiety. Instead of trying to eliminate or overcome these responses, we need to understand them as part of our fundamental humanity and learn to channel them constructively. When you stand before an audience, your primitive brain is not just assessing the threat of rejection, it is also unconsciously scanning for opportunities to connect, to contribute something valuable, to strengthen social bonds through shared information and experience. The same neural circuits that flood you with stress hormones when you perceive social threat also activate when you successfully communicate something meaningful to others. The neurochemical reward systems that motivate human bonding can be triggered by effective public speaking just as powerfully as they are activated by intimate conversation. This is why some people become addicted to public speaking despite their initial terror. Once they experience the deep satisfaction of connecting with an audience, of seeing understanding dawn in listeners' faces, of contributing something valuable to others' thinking, the same biological systems that once generated fear begin generating profound reward. The neurofeedback data shows that successful speakers are not those who experience no anxiety, but those who learn to ride the wave of arousal that comes with social activation. Their brains show high activity in both fear centers and reward centers simultaneously, creating the focused energy and heightened awareness that characterize peak performance. This explains something I have observed throughout my career. The speakers who seem most natural and compelling often report significant pre-presentation nerves. Their anxiety and their effectiveness spring from the same source: deep engagement with the social and emotional dimensions of communication. Understanding this connection helps explain why traditional approaches to speaking anxiety often fail. When we try to eliminate fear, we risk also eliminating the social sensitivity and emotional engagement that make communication meaningful. The goal should not be fearlessness, but rather learning to interpret and channel your social arousal productively. This requires developing a more sophisticated relationship with your own emotional responses, rather than simply trying to suppress them. I now see speaking anxiety as part of a broader pattern of what I call social intelligence overflow. People who experience intense presentation anxiety often also report feeling overwhelmed in large social gatherings, becoming exhausted after extensive interpersonal interactions, and being deeply affected by others' emotions. These are not separate problems, they are different manifestations of the same underlying trait, a nervous system that is highly responsive to social information. This responsiveness creates vulnerabilities in certain contexts, but also enables exceptional social capabilities in others. Many of my most anxious patients are also the people others turn to for emotional support, who notice when someone is struggling before anyone else does, who can read the mood of a room instantly and respond appropriately to social dynamics. Their speaking anxiety represents the cost of having a social radar system that is always active, always scanning for information about relationships, acceptance, and group harmony. The same system that makes them wonderful friends and partners also makes them vulnerable to overwhelm when that social awareness is focused on them by an audience. Recognizing this connection has led me to help patients appreciate rather than eliminate their social sensitivity. The goal becomes learning to manage and direct this sensitivity rather than numbing or suppressing it. This reframing often provides immediate relief from the shame and self-criticism that typically accompany speaking anxiety. When people understand that their fear stems from the same capacities that make them caring, empathetic individuals, they can begin to develop a more compassionate relationship with their own anxiety. The evolutionary perspective adds another layer to this understanding. Throughout human history, the individuals most concerned about group acceptance were also those most motivated to contribute positively to group welfare. They became the healers, the teachers, the storytellers, the leaders who could sense and respond to collective needs. Speaking anxiety may represent your unconscious recognition that you have something important to offer others, combined with concern about whether you can deliver it effectively. The fear is not just about rejection, it is about failing to fulfill your potential contribution to the group. This interpretation explains why speaking anxiety is often most intense when the stakes feel meaningful. People rarely experience severe anxiety when presenting information they consider trivial or unimportant. The fear typically correlates with the perceived value of what you have to share and your concern about sharing it effectively. Your anxiety may be your psyche's way of ensuring that you take seriously the responsibility of addressing other people's time, attention, and trust. It represents an unconscious recognition that communication is a sacred act that deserves careful attention and respect. The neurofeedback research has also revealed something important about recovery from speaking experiences. The brain patterns of people who have positive speaking experiences show increased activity in reward and bonding centers for hours afterward. Successful presentations literally activate the same systems that create feelings of love, connection, and belonging. This suggests that public speaking, when approached skillfully, can be profoundly fulfilling rather than simply something to be endured. The biological systems that create initial fear are the same ones that can generate deep satisfaction when the experience goes well. Understanding this potential for transformation changes the entire framework for approaching speaking anxiety. Instead of viewing it as an obstacle to overcome, you can see it as energy to be channeled toward meaningful connection with others. The deeper understanding I have developed over 3 decades of working with speaking anxiety is that this fear connects us to our most fundamental human needs: to belong, to contribute, to be seen and valued by others. It is not a bug in our psychological software, it is a feature that has helped our species survive and thrive for millions of years. When you feel that familiar flutter of anxiety before speaking, you are experiencing the same neural activation that has motivated countless generations of humans to care about their relationships, to contribute to their communities, and to take seriously the profound responsibility of human communication. Your fear is not evidence of weakness or inadequacy. It is evidence that you understand, at the deepest level, that words have power, that communication matters, and that connecting with others is one of the most important things any human being can do. The goal is not to eliminate this understanding, but to honor it, while developing the skills needed to act effectively despite the fear. When you can do this, speaking becomes not just communication, but an act of courage, connection, and service to others. This is why overcoming speaking anxiety is ultimately about much more than presentations. It is about learning to trust your own voice, to value your unique perspective, and to believe that what you have to offer matters enough to risk the vulnerability that all meaningful communication requires. Your fear of speaking is inseparable from your capacity to care about others. Learning to speak despite that fear is one of the most profoundly human things you can do.